call, as there are people who are asynchronously joining us for this call. We have a couple of students in the other side of the world listening in. It's my great pleasure to welcome Afa S. Dworkin, the president and artistic director of the Sphinx organization. And I'm so excited for our students and our community to learn more about Sphinx and to meet Afa and be in conversation as we have been all semester in our various guests. Afa is our 6th guest of our 12-speaker series. And we've spoken to Daniel Bernard Romain, Rachel Barton Pine, Aaron Flagg, Carlos Simon, Jerry Johnson. So, and we have upcoming speakers that are really fantastic. But let me just do a little bit class business for everybody. So everybody, I'm just reminding everyone to turn on their video so that Mr. Dworkin can interact with you and watch you and engage with you. So that's just manners and common courtesy. Also, I'm just reminding you that I'm putting up all of the discussion forums, and because there are a few people who are asynchronously participating and sometimes things happen, so your participation really comes from your interaction on the discussion forum. So we really want you to post the questions that I'm forwarding onto our guests, and I really need the questions to be in the night before so that I can at least give them at least a morning or a half a day worth of time to react to. So please get the questions in time, because if it comes in, now we're not going to get to them. So please get the discussions in, get the readings or whatever videos or things that our guests ask you to post and interact with. 2 reminders. Next week on Wednesday, October 14th, we do not have a session. It's a no class day for the entire Cornell community. I'm honoring that. So I will really miss interacting with everybody. So don't show up on next Wednesday because we don't have anything scheduled. However, that means the week after, you are all college aged at least, so I'm not going to hold your hand in terms of sending too many reminders out, but I'm going to remind everybody, due to Jessie Montgomery's teaching schedule, she was not able to join us on Wednesday the 21st. So there's a special time for Jessie Montgomery, which is Tuesday, 5 p.m. on October 20, which means all the questions need to be in the day before, which is not Tuesday, but Monday. So by Monday evening, all the questions should be in. That way I can send the questions on to Jessie Montgomery on Tuesday morning. So please put that in your calendar. Okay, got that. Sorry?
Could you say that again?
Are you serious? Okay. Jessie Montgomery is here Tuesday, October 20. That means the questions have to be in on Monday, right? Not Tuesday as usual. Okay. All right. That's all the class business I want to do. I want to apologize and to remind the mentors. Last week I did the calculation wrong with the time difference. So we'll be meeting next Monday at 5 p.m. I already sent out the Zoom link to Kirkland, so you'll be getting an email from Kirkland. So without further ado, let's welcome Afa S. Dworkin, our 6th speaker on this series. Okay.
Go ahead, Chris. I don't know if you want to say more.
Yeah, so I thought it'll be great for us to get an overview of the Sphinx organization and all of the different arms and efforts of this magnificent organization and the impact it's having. So could you kind of walk us through all of the different wings and initiatives that the Sphinx organization is involved in now?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, great to be here, and I love doing these. Of course, with the advent of COVID, I've had greater opportunities to interact with campuses all around the world, actually. Normally, I belong to the faculty at Roosevelt University to their Master's in Arts Leadership and Administration, so that's kind of my domain. This past year, I've been teaching at the University of Michigan, which is my alma mater and how I met Chris first. But since then, I've had a chance to virtually visit 10 to 15 campuses. So it's definitely an honor to be with you at Cornell. Just a tiny bit about myself is that I am a recovering violinist. And I say this because my training is squarely in violin performance and just a bit in string pedagogy as well. So by all indications, my planning as a young person was such that I was going to go into performance and was most likely going to have some sort of a portfolio career that would encompass playing the violin and probably doing some teaching. But as fate would have it, things lined up in a bit of a different way, and I couldn't be more grateful. I'm a transplant. I was born in Moscow, Russia, and raised in the former Soviet Union. So my training, by and large, until college age, is actually not from the States. I grew up speaking 3 languages, none of which were English. I come from a mixed parentage household, and one of the greatest opportunities in my life has been access to wonderful free music education, and something that I wish for every young person here in the States, in our locale and elsewhere, to have. Because one thing that we were provided was access to excellent education without regard to your zip code or ethnicity or cultural background. And I think that's something that has become a part of my life's work and my personal mission. When I was almost 18, due to a set of odd circumstances, I came to the States with my parents with the idea of only spending a year here, and then to go back home and go back to conservatory. But as things happened, I ended up actually staying in Michigan and auditioning for and beginning my studies at the University of Michigan as an undergrad student in violin performance, and that same year joining the Ann Arbor Symphony. About a year into it, I ended up meeting someone, a classmate who was actually a transfer student from Penn State, who had this odd idea of promoting diversity in classical music, which at the time made no sense to me at all. I asked kind of the point about it because I grew up with the idea and a notion that we are all of one community. And in music, everything is based upon and built upon meritocracy. So the only thing that should matter is, in fact, how well you play and how hard you work and how well you do on stage. But I quickly came to realize that that limited view was definitely not the reality in my adopted country here in the States. And as this friend of mine was talking to me about his dream of creating a festival where young musicians of color, much like himself, would get together and perform and share their talents and be given opportunities, I kind of thought this was interesting, but I still just lacked the understanding of why. So I began to ask questions. And one of the first early questions he asked me, the 19-year-old then, he asked, when do you last remember being on stage and seeing anyone of color as part of the ranks of the orchestra? And I had to think about that one and couldn't come up with very much. His next question was, you're a repertory buff. You study a lot of music by living composers and some of the great new stuff that exists out there. But when was the last time you played or studied something that was by Black or Latinx composer? And I, of course, couldn't come up with anything. So in a defensive fashion, I said something like, well, I don't know, Duke Ellington, somebody. There's definitely music. We definitely know there's something out there. But I really had a difficult time, and I didn't even know about William Grant Still or anyone of the sort, or Philip Herbert, whose music you just heard, or certainly a plethora of others I've come to study and love over the years. So it began to make sense to me that it's entirely illogical to have whole groups of population not at all represented in our field. And that while I grew up with the idea of conformity and solidarity and not at all diversity, it seemed like here in this country, diversity should be reprioritized in such a way that a whole art form that I know and love and I know has changed my life should really also be a part of a life of any young person who so desires to be to have that advantage and that form of education. So lo and behold, this classmate of mine, then friend, now partner, Aaron Dworkin, comes and says, well, I've decided I'm going to build something I'm going to call the Sphinx Competition. It will be like a festival, but a competitive mechanism for young musicians of color. They're going to be all strings musicians, we're going to get together, we'll showcase them, we'll come up with prize money and really put them out there on the arena so that orchestras and conservatories and music schools can begin to engage them so that we can really try to infuse this diverse talent into the pipeline, into the field. And I said, that's awesome. Who's going to fund this? It sounds like the most ridiculous thing, but I certainly want to help. So my way of helping was to get involved and help research competition guidelines and research repertory, since that is something with which I grew up and loved. So that was kind of the beginning of my journey at Sphinx. Back then in 1997, I became the first intern while still a student at the University of Michigan, and became an intern who never left. Been at Sphinx since the inception, and it's been a quarter of a century, and it's been quite a ride. So while Sphinx started as a singular idea for a flagship program that would essentially be a competition or a festival, it quickly grew out of itself into something much greater. We think of it as a movement. Sphinx now is a national social justice organization, is how we think of ourselves. And our mission is transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. And the way we do this is through a whole variety of programs. They sort of are in 4 silos, so to speak, that are all interconnected through a family of our artists and leaders. Kind of the first component or umbrella is education and access. So that's all about creative youth development. In this area, our programs encompass biweekly training of elementary school students on string instruments in Detroit and Flint, Michigan, through both group lessons, but also subsidized private lessons and creation of other scholarship opportunities and performance opportunities for those families. In this way, we serve approximately 350 young people, ages 8 to 10, and a greater number if we encompass all of the private students. So the idea there behind Sphinx Overture is to create a year-long experience for kids who have literally no other alternatives. And by the way, at Sphinx, every single program is cost-free to its participants, because one of the ways in which we hope to remove any barrier is simply to not have parents worry about the money or access points. So instruments are provided, lessons are provided, and one does not have to think about the economical barrier in such a way. Overture began with a small idea of being in 3 classrooms in Detroit with only 10 kids at a time. It eventually grew tremendously and now also occurs throughout the summer as well. In the age of COVID, we've transitioned Overture to a virtual format and have been actually able to triple the number of private lessons that we've been able to teach virtually to our kids, just to keep them engaged from March until now. Another piece of our educational programming is also Sphinx Performance Academy. So whereas Overture kids are young people at the very beginning of their journey, conversely, Sphinx Performance Academy, or SPA as we refer to it, is for intermediate advanced level kids. So these are young people ages 11 through 17. And this program, under normal circumstances, occurs on 3 different campuses throughout the country, at Juilliard School, as well as Curtis Institute and Cleveland Institute of Music. This past summer, for the first time, and I hope the last time, it was held all virtually. So we served 92 kids in that manner, and it was really quite rewarding. But generally, SPA focuses on chamber music development, that early ensemble skills and interaction, and learning how to collaborate with one another in music and in life. It also provides basic musicianship classes, the fundamentals of music theory, background on music history, citizenship classes, and a whole series of master classes that we provide for the kids, as well as social activities and field trips that we organize for them. And supplementing the chamber music experience are intensive every other day private lessons that the kids also receive on all 3 campuses. So that's kind of the educational piece. Besides these ongoing programs throughout the year, we do other kind of special activities and events, both virtually as well as in person for young people. And for all of our other concerts and presentations, we make a special effort to attract the youngest audiences and deliver the content, both the educational and the performance content, to young people as audiences as well. In that fashion, we reach anywhere between 8,000 and 10,000 young people throughout the year. each year, including the COVID year, actually. The other silo or umbrella or program area is our artist development, and that's fairly broad. It contains our oldest program, the Sphinx Competition, which is a competitive mechanism for young Black and Latinx string musicians. The idea there is, in a competitive way, we attract some of the most talented young people of color who play string instruments, and they compete in front of an international jury. All of them receive access to fine instruments, prizes, significant prizes, and performance opportunities. But most importantly, they essentially enter into the Sphinx family, which means they're part of the movement, part of the conglomerate of the Sphinx programming. And once one enters into the competition and advances to the very first round, they're then entitled to all of the other benefits within this artist development program area, which includes Music Assistance Fund, which is literally a fund to support their careers, but also access to college scholarships and summer scholarships, etc. They also can participate in the National Alliance for Audition Support, which is a whole consortium of organizations who come together along with the League of American Orchestras, New World Symphony, and 82 orchestras along with Sphinx. And together we've built a whole separate conglomerate of programs that encompass orchestral training, mock auditions, and a big fund that supports the actual audition process, as well as coachings and preparation for young musicians who are on the orchestral career path. So essentially, once you're part of the Sphinx competition family, you have access to something like this as well. And then separately, during the Sphinx competition, we employed two different orchestras, and that's our Sphinx Symphony and the Sphinx Honors Orchestra, who accompany the competition participants and also perform throughout the year separately as well. Performing artists is our third program area, and it essentially is a collection of touring ensembles. We have a professional vocal ensemble that tours across the country, and this year is touring digitally just to keep up with innovation during COVID, as well as two professional quartets and a series of soloists. We have a roster of approximately 20 different soloists that we promote, but also the Sphinx Virtuosi, which is our main and premier touring ensemble that does travel around the country and the world throughout the year. It used to tour once a year in the fall, and now it tours throughout the year, inclusive of spring and summer as well. So essentially, Sphinx Virtuosi is comprised of alumni of the Sphinx competition who now perform professionally. And this is a bilingual ensemble that specifically focuses on presenting works by lesser known composers with an emphasis on Black and Latinx composers. It commissions a work, at least one or two new works every year, and specializes in living composers. It also does a lot by way of presentations and educational activities. And at the moment, they've recorded a series of digital packages that they're delivering throughout the campuses around the country and doing some of this virtual teaching since we can't perform on stage. So that's kind of performing artists, and it's a growing area, an important area for Sphinx's programming. And then finally, arts leadership, which is probably the youngest and the newest area of Sphinx's life and our programming. It encompasses our global convening we call Sphinx Connect. It attracts more than 1,000 musicians, educators, entrepreneurs, arts leaders across the country who come together in Detroit in early February annually. And during that experience, we offer everything from workshops to master classes to panel discussions, keynote presentations, performances. It's an entire convening dedicated to issues of diversity in the performing arts and with a focus on classical music. Beyond that, arts leadership also has the Sphinx Medal of Excellence program, which is the highest award that we bestow upon emerging musicians of color who are achieving extraordinary things every year. This comes with a $50,000 prize. For those of you from the performance world, which is probably everybody actually in this case, it's really similar to the Avery Fisher Prize, but it has an educational and career development component to it as well. Sphinx Empower is our artist grant mechanism. Sphinx is also a big regranter. We create and fundraise for and annually award career grants to our alumni who are doing innovative work in a variety of different spheres, not necessarily all performance related. Some of it is arts leadership, education, community engagement, but it's all geared toward empowering the leadership work of our alumni in their own communities. Sphinx Lead and Venture Fund are both the youngest program by far. Sphinx Lead is only 2 years old, and in short, it's the Sphinx competition, but for administrators of color. We competitively select 10 every year for a 2-year intensive educational and career development program. The goal of it is to empower emerging leaders of color in the administrative world who are going to assume C-suite and leadership gigs in other institutions. So there are 19 fellows currently, because we've only been around for 2 years with this program. 7 of them have received placement or advancement and are in CEO positions or C-suite positions already. So it's a fastest growing program, I would say, in terms of its reputation, its need. There is nothing quite like it that exists in the industry. So it's something that I plan to spend a lot of time really fortifying and reinforcing. In addition to that, of course, these leaders also serve as Sphinx ambassadors and kind of tell the Sphinx gospel elsewhere and are excellent spokespeople for the mission, of course. And finally, Sphinx Venture Fund is also along the lines of Sphinx acting like a regranter. Here, very specifically, this is to inspire and propel the appetite of leaders and other organizations, other nonprofits in our country particularly, with the idea that they would come up with and propose ideas that solve issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion through innovative approaches and new programming that encompass scope, impact, and mission. This came from a belief of mine, and I remain with this belief, but I've always thought that Sphinx cannot achieve a big enough difference on its own. We need to learn to achieve results through others. And as such, we rely strongly on our 110 or 115 partners across the country. And as such, we've devised an actual venture fund that would instigate this appetite amongst leaders who are seeking to make a difference, but maybe don't have the resources. So these are large grants and only a couple are given every year. So actually this chapter of awardees is going to be announced in the coming weeks as well. So we're really excited about that. So in all, Sphinx it can be described as a social justice organization that works in classical music, but also envisions itself as a service to the field organization, because what we are is probably a pipeline maker and a catalyst. And by that, I mean, we encourage and push others to be change makers, but we also have resources at our disposal and direct programming as well as funding to be able to infuse into the field by directly empowering careers, by directly investing in artists, but also by making and creating opportunities, not only for our own artists and alumni, but also for the field to connect with our family members. So that's kind of the way that Sphinx sees itself. We think of ourselves as an entrepreneurial organization that also reinvents or tweaks its mission and work in accordance with the need of our community and also in accordance with the times. I think it's really important to stay nimble in this world and respond to the needs as we see fit, so long as it also corresponds with the core mission of the work that we do. I should also say that specifically on a statistical level, when Sphinx was launched, and as it relates to our conversation today that's centered more or less around orchestras, Black and Latino musicians comprise 1.5% together in the 90s. Today, we're at about 4.6% combined in American orchestras. So has there been change? Yes, it's been incremental. It most certainly is in need of more of a sweeping change. And a lot of the work that Sphinx does is to push for or impel the field to do more. And really try to illustrate by example, but also by collaboration, that unless we seek out ways to do things differently, we're not going to end up with different results. And as such, we can't expect to diversify or be reflective of our communities unless we're prepared to change some of our processes and prepared to get a little uncomfortable. So a lot of the work I've been doing since May, particularly since George Floyd's murder, and the after effect of what that has done to our country and our field, has been talking to many orchestras and other arts institutions about how to bring about change in a way that's both authentic and lasting, but also in a way that's more than incremental. And that's kind of where we find ourselves today at Sphinx. I'll pause here because that sort of marks the 20-minute a lot of time, and see if Chris wants us to go to either questions or another phase, or maybe address something at the intersection here.
Yeah, we really appreciate this overview, because I think in our previous conversations, I think we have gotten to a place where we have come to realization that there is a problem. There is a inequity and racism in classical music and orchestra. And then we got to a place where, okay, well, what can we do? And then Rachel Bartons-Pine's presentation of her project of advocating for Black composers for the last 2 decades. So gave us a tangible way artists are making a difference in education and what kind of repertoire students are studying. And then, but as we move into a discussion about auditions, and the barriers that are presented, the problem seems to grow and grow in terms of, it's like climate change, or how can I possibly make a difference in this structural problem where we see such a huge amount of inequalities in every level, in terms of not just the professional auditions in an orchestras, but training of musicians in the conservatory. And then people complain about the pipeline not having enough education opportunities, not just at the collegiate level, but the secondary and the elementary school, and then pre-K. So then we're kind of we're in this sort of state of, oh my goodness, it's such a huge problem that how can I, as an undergraduate at Cornell, possibly contribute anything to solving this problem? But then, the whole idea of Sphinx came about when Aaron Dworkin was an undergraduate at University of Michigan. So there are 2 things that I would like to offer our students: that no matter how big or enormous the problem seems to be, there is always a way you can contribute and make a change. And here's an example: an organization that grew from a single undergraduate's dream, and there were enough people who thought it was important to help him realize this idea, and it has now become this multifaceted organization that is affecting so many different people at so many different levels, in artist training and education, in arts leadership. So this is a really helpful overview of what Sphinx does. So let me kind of go further into asking you a question in regard to our students' perspective of how to move forward in their own lives, in making a difference in their own communities. What advice would you give to these undergrads at Cornell who are not music majors, who are not heading to a profession in music, but they will be heading into all kinds of different fields? Are there things that they can do today, tomorrow, in 5 years, 10 years, that will make a difference?
Absolutely. I think I agree completely, Chris. I believe every one of us can and should lead from every seat, without regard to our very specific chosen profession or station in life. I think some of the basic ways in which one might contribute is through your citizenship. Even though you may not be a performer that's headed into specifically a professional orchestra necessarily, you may be playing as part of a community orchestra. So their advocacy of repertoire by Black and Brown composers, for example, is a big piece. And if you play for pleasure, selecting works that are reflective of those backgrounds that, by the way, comprise the largest minority groups in our country, but are most dramatically underrepresented within the ranks of orchestras. So certainly by patronizing and engaging with and sharing music by those underrepresented composers is one of the ways. The other way is, of course, you'll become patrons and audience members. So supporting organizations and artists who are doing some of this pioneering work. Since May, I have seen a sea change amongst orchestras who are specifically selecting repertoire they would otherwise not even consider by Black and Brown composers. And now I'm only holding, crossing my fingers that this not be sort of a passing fancy, but it's something that endures, because there's a lot of fantastic music that really deserves to be presented on big stages. So certainly, contributing to the work of other organizations and artists who are selecting to do it. And I've seen some really fantastic solo artists also begin to champion these works that are otherwise not at all known. So those are some of the ways. The other thing is, I'm sure you will form other affinity groups and become members of other organizations and groups where the arts and education are supported, empowered, in some cases funded. So drawing attention to these basic statistics, such as the stark underrepresentation and a lack of diversity, lack of really inclusiveness in the field of classical music and performing arts as a general, is an important gospel to continue to preach, because if it becomes part of our narrative, it then becomes something we all embrace as a society. And it can no longer stay kind of in the corner in complete shroud of silence and neglected until a big tragedy befalls our country again. So really, through advocacy, selection, and patronizing of works, and direct support of being ticket holders and audience members and otherwise consumers of both current composers and music that was created, decades and centuries ago by underrepresented composers. Those are some of the basic ways I'm thinking one can participate no matter what.
So I'm going to thread in some questions through that, but I'm going to try my best to sort of stay from one thread to the next. In both the New York Times article that I've assigned to the students to read and in the podcast they had access to, at one point you challenged the orchestras to devote perhaps 10% or half of their budget towards diversity and inclusion for the next 10 years, rather than sort of a short-term effect. And so here's Alex Bonilla's question of, how should orchestras address the lack of music education in low-income and minority schools? Could you talk about that challenge to orchestras, but also the kind of response have received to that challenge of devoting perhaps 10% of the budget for the next 10 years to diversity efforts and repertoire and soloists who are African American and Latinx? What kind of feedback have you gotten from organizations?
Sure. So there are a few kind of parts to this question, and I'll try to address each. Interestingly, within the question from Alex is something really important, I think. The piece on the pipeline. I always like to challenge that a little bit, in that I think it's just human nature, in my experience, whenever it is that a problem seems insurmountably big and we feel that it's perhaps something we can't handle alone or shouldn't take on because it's likely not to succeed, we tend to blame things or assign that shroud of impossibility to it by making the problem as distant as possible. So to sit in my seat and say, there's really a pipeline issue, not enough young kids are studying of color, so as such, I don't have enough young kids to recruit and engage. Well, in our lifetime, certainly in mine, and I'm considerably older than all of you, it's not likely that we're going to change what's happening in schools on any systemic and global level here in this country anyway. In other words, we're not going to necessitate or demand that every elementary and middle school student have experiential music as part of their curriculum. We can demand all day long, but it's not likely to happen, right? So it's just still going to vary district by district. So because we know that's not realistic, we throw our hands in the air and say, well, it's just too big of a problem. It's a pipeline issue. I can't deal with it. It's not something I can solve. Well, interestingly, that's why it's so great we have statistics. If one goes to the available statistics from the National Association for Schools of Music, we can actually see that our community music schools and community music centers look a whole lot more diverse than our professional orchestras or conservatories, because in fact, those music schools, community music schools, those pre-professional, pre-college level institutions have done a far better job creating mechanisms where tuition isn't as prohibitive. And in fact, they are far more inclusive. So if you look at members of the Guild, as well as the student family membership in Sistema USA programs all throughout the country, you'll see that it's rather diverse. We then plummet when we get to undergraduate level conservatory education, School of Musics and conservatories. And then it goes down from there into, from undergraduate degrees into masters. And there's a tiny, tiny bit of spark then, the spike into DMA, particularly in voice and education, not so much in instrumental performance. So what this tells us is that, first of all, the pipeline problem is the wrong problem to label. It's not really a pipeline problem. Am I saying something that's absolutely ludicrous? I don't think so. Certainly, I would like to make music instrumental instruction accessible to everyone, everywhere, not just children of color, but also white children of lower socioeconomic background. However, that's still not the biggest problem, because even with that, within the context of those insane challenges, we still have a healthy pipeline that's coming through these community music schools. And then on an individual level, from the Sphinx standpoint, every summer we accept only 25% of the entire pool of young kids who apply to our summer program. So these are 11 and 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds, by and large, who apply. And those kids are, if they're not ready that moment, then within a year or two, they're going to be conservatory ready. So to say there's a pipeline problem is just to distract the problem. What we do have is an engagement and a focus and a dedication problem, because if you take those 90 kids, distribute them into music schools and conservatories, guess what? Our schools of music are going to be more diverse. And we stand a bigger shot to then usher them and push them through and shepherd their journeys into professional conservatories, and then onward to more advanced degrees, and certainly to professional orchestras. So that's where I push. But this kind of an effort does take resources, because it also will take restructuring, rededication of staff time and thinking amongst orchestras. So to answer your second question, Chris, about the kind of response I've gotten, it has ranged from a polite nod to, well, we see what you're saying, but it's going to be really confused. It's going to be complicated. But I'll say that I've also heard from a number of directors of major orchestras who've said, challenge received. We don't know about 10 years, but certainly dedicating a portion very specifically to DEI actually dedicating budget dollars toward DEI issues specifically is something we're absolutely going to do. I haven't heard someone say, yes, we'll do 15% of our subscription series dedicated to Black and Brown composers. But what I have seen is we have been inundated with requests for literature, guidance on repertoire, also guidance on soloists they can engage, who from the Sphinx family could be collaborating with them. That, I would say, I've seen a really tremendous difference. And now I am watching the Detroit Symphony, Philadelphia Orchestra, and a number of others programming completely, the New Jersey Symphony. I see a difference in programming approach, even in the age of COVID, where there is an intentional effort to engage some of this incredible neglected repertoire, and also artists of color who have been deserving of being on stage for a long time. So I would say, to qualify the response, has it been ideal? No, but has it been starkly different than historically? Yes, I would say so.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in that sort of Daniel, kind of in my conversation with Daniel and Carlos Simon, we all described this moment of the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter. It's sort of this time frame in which all of a sudden people have the time to reflect, So it's not sort of your season as usual, where every arts organization thinks about the 2 year in advance, sort of that sort of unending cycle. But all of a sudden, there is a shutdown, there is a stoppage of time where organizations are having to think about how to survive. But in that moment, there's also this time of reflection about how orchestras have been operating and making the kinds of decision that were exclusionary. So I do think there is sort of this, it feels like to many of us who care about this issue, there is this window of opportunity to address this issue. It's like, I think Carlos said it to me, it's not as if this is a new problem. This has been a problem that has existed for a long time. It's just that all of a sudden now people who are in charge of boards and orchestras, they're actually paying attention to this issue of inequities and racism in classical music. So I'm going to connect this over to Casey's question of how can we make the case that there is no need to compromise on quality while diversifying orchestras? Because I think this is touching on the Mr. Ramey's quote about that old sort of opinion. If we do go to diverse artists and in terms of opening up, then you're going to be compromising artistic quality. So how do we respond to this kind of thinking that they somehow think the opposite of what you said earlier, that by opening up the participation to a more diverse candidate of pools, we're actually going to raise the quality of discussion, raise the quality of exploration repertoire. But there is this old stance that somehow if you open it up to a wider pool, that you're going to compromise on quality, that you're, by having a criterion in the, rather than a blind audition of just listening to the musical merits of a candidate, by adding the elements of, can this person be a spokesperson for the orchestra in a diverse community? They're afraid that that's going to be a compromise on artistic quality. How do we counter these arguments that are again and again coming up from those who are in power?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And fundamentally, I think unless we tackle that, I'm not sure much else can be accomplished. One of the things I share with many in my own classrooms and audiences across the country is that we might consider taking a page out of the book of other industries who have done better by way of diversification and succeeding in innovation. And two industries that come to mind are both the banking industry, not that it's done things perfectly by any means and does not have a checkered past, not at all. But if we look at the banking industry, also, if we look at the tech industry, essentially the line of thinking there for the past probably couple of decades has been that you want to put as many innovators in a room of as many different backgrounds as possible, because diversity actually is both an intellectual and an economic driver for success. So, and one of the reasons that they do it is because it also seeds a bit of discomfort. It moves us away from the like culture. And the echo chambers that we so much need in today's world, because we need to have our thoughts echoed, otherwise we don't feel validated. But in fact, unless we introduce different thoughts, different perspectives, different musical perspectives, interpretations, different sorts of creativity and different convictions on an artistic level, we cease to connect. And when we cease to connect, then we cease to be relevant. And when we are not relevant, we become extinct. So to me, it's a very simple way toward slow death. Unless we figure out a way to be relevant to the communities in which we reside, and the communities that we say we want to serve, then there isn't a way for us to really thrive. I think thriving comes from diversity. Diversity breeds excellence. In fact, I would argue that excellence is entirely impossible now to foster and sustain unless we are diverse. And if we weren't so inclined to look at other industries, which I think would be a shame, one of the things we can think about is how much homogeneity there is in the sound of American orchestras now. At the turn of the century, in 20th century, there were distinctive sounds. They would differ from St. Louis Symphony to Philadelphia Orchestra to New York Philharmonic. And the manner in which they would differ is that they would each showcase different representations or influxes of immigrant populations that would settle in these various regions of the country, thereby shaping a new sound for that orchestra. So as such, one could actually close one's eyes and tell a difference between the Philharmonic and Philadelphia Orchestra. Today, that would be a challenging thing to do because by and large, they sound excellent, but the same. And also, by and large, also playing the same repertoire, which is definitely, I think, one of the other reasons that we must innovate with the times is that I think unless we care to stay and label ourselves as cover bands of yesteryear rather than collectives of creatives and artistic professionals, which I think might be more fitting for the 21st century. I think all of those kind of rebrandings in some ways, or reformatting of what it is to be an orchestra and orchestral musician, that would be impossible without thinking of excellence. And as such, you can't think of excellence absent of or somehow devoid of diversity. Now, you touched on the whole notion of blind auditions. I know that that piece is complex, but I always urge professionals and students that I speak with to not make it more complex than it has to be. The notion or the impetus behind blind auditions was a noble one in that it was to instill and create and invite a prospectivity behind blind auditions. But I think as we examine that, just as I don't think it's helpful to simply say, let's do away with all the screens and it'll get fixed, because I think it drives people away more than it does bring people together. But I think at the same time, while I don't think that's necessarily terribly productive or realistic in our world here in the States, what I think is also not productive is to say we must stay with blind auditions. And the reason I have a problem with that statement is because we don't have blind auditions. Those are not blind. First of all, somebody first decides if I am with everything that's on my resume and good enough to be invited for an audition. And in order to do that, they look at my information, my resume, my experience, and decide whether I'm good enough to do that before they anonymize my name. Someone's already formed an opinion. If my name is as funny as mine is, for example, it's certainly going to bring about some questions, and sometimes more than questions. Number one. Number two, the vast majority of American orchestras do not keep their screen up the entire time. It comes up at some point, either in the finals, sometimes earlier, and it then is met with yet another phase of adjudication that is called trial weeks. And if I were to calculate the number of times when folks who are entirely qualified do not get selected because they simply do not get on with someone in the orchestra who makes some of those decisions, I think the notion of blind audition gets thrown out the door. The only way we test the effectiveness of blind auditions is if we truly, truly make them blind. That means from the beginning to the end, anyone can audition. From the beginning to the end, we do not judge anything but what we hear. I would be, on a theoretical level, I wouldn't be opposed to something like this, but I do think in today's world, that should be only one element of consideration of inviting someone in an orchestra. Other elements should also include adjudicating one's ability for being a spokesperson, for being a teaching artist, and there are other citizenship qualities that should qualify them to be a member of an orchestra.
Yeah, I completely hear you.
So as such, I'm arguing they're not enough.
Yeah, I hear we're having a little bit of a lag issue, but it's true, absolutely true what you're saying, that we all need to define what people mean by blind auditions as the same thing, because many times when we enter into that conversation, when somebody means blind audition, it doesn't mean what you think it means, because as you said, many of the auditions rely on that trial period, that connection to teachers. Even the process of asking someone to audition is a lot of back channel conversation that happens, for which many of the African American artists, Latinx artists, are actually excluded out of that. So for someone to argue that blind audition will solve all the problems, I think they're being disingenuous in not defining it correctly. And I think Daniel Bernard Romain, when he was with us, he raised the point. There really should be a process and a criterion by which a person is involved in joining an orchestra and organization. We don't have blind audition situation with any other facet in our society. We audition we interview the person for the position, and we consider many different criterions rather than sort of sliding into this sliver of well, can this engineer execute these problems in a short amount of time? We don't do that in our society. We consider the whole person. So I think, especially in this time when musicians are expected to be more than just craftsmen and technicians, I think they really have to be persons of who will engage with the community, who will be able to speak on behalf of not just the organization, but for the art form, and to be able to connect with people of all different races. So I think that skill set involves more than just playing notes in tune, in time, the right notes in the right place. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm going to shift a little bit to repertoire because Jonah Capella. So I'm going to sort of, because it's a long question, so I'm going to reduce it a little bit. So in talking about repertoire, it's one thing to say to the orchestra, okay, we're going to do Mahler 1, because the audience, the orchestra, the administrators, they all know what that means in terms of the size of the orchestra needed, what kind of piece it'll be, what kind of piece will accompany that piece. But the difficulty of including repertoire that is unknown, that is unfamiliar to the audience, to the orchestra, what are some of the tools that would allow for orchestras to be able to include works from underrepresented composers? Because the repertoire is so unknown, I think there are two levels, right? There's the level of the people who are programming need to know the piece. So what are mechanisms by which we can help orchestras get to know these composers and repertoire? But then two, what are there resources that we can give to orchestras to help introduce these pieces to the audience and the community? Because I think they're so afraid of, well, there was a survey done by the League of American Orchestras that had a perfect formula, right? If you have Tchaikovsky, Mozart, and Beethoven and offer free parking, you have a sold-out concert, right? But if you have Haydn, a contemporary work, and a piece by Pleyel, then you will lose money on that concert. Right, they even had metrics of a piano soloist versus a clarinet soloist. So when you're talking to organizations that are so used to measuring metrics of how they form repertoire in order to make money on that concert, and thereby being a viable financial sort of organization, and then trying to convince them to think about other factors in introducing unknown repertoire, underrepresented composers, are there things that we can help to educate both the programmer in terms of the artistic leaders, but also in helping educate the marketers and the bean counters of how we can make this repertoire available to a wider audience?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely it's a good and a fair question. Relative first to the former part of it, which is, are there tools for programmers and artistic administrators who are trying to build a season? Absolutely. Not the least of which is one of the things I like to sometimes share with students and even colleagues is that we can't sink into the Columbus effect here. We're not discovering something that's always been here. We are learning about something we have for a long time ignored, but it's new to us, but it isn't new per se. As such, there are basic tools such as Diverse Composers Database, which is a comprehensive, really relational repository of repertoire that can be searched by specificity of a composer's cultural background and race, length, instrumentation breadth, specific orchestration, and even time period of when the work is written, so as to imagine whether it is something that's likely to sound neoclassical or rather avant-garde. So there are definitely basic, not complicated research tools. One of the other basic tools is just going on Sphinx's website and looking at the resources page and clicking on repertoire, which will list other ways in which to search things that have been commissioned by other organizations, by Black and Latinx composers. So that's certainly on a very basic level, that's a way in which programmers can have access to this information. Then secondarily, once programmers become conversant in their options, one of the other ways in which they can get to that piece quicker and learn to engage their audiences and bring the audiences closer to the music that they're performing is to offer them something that would never be possible with Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, or the Wagner cycle. Because one of the beautiful things about programming works by living composers is that you can invite them to curate the content and talk to your audiences about how and why a particular work is written and what it might mean and how it might carry relevance to your audiences, which means you can create a whole other kind of an experience that might, if anything, engage and attract your steady audiences who just might wish to learn, but also new audiences who may not have been heretofore that interested in coming and to hear another, Bruckner cycle. Nothing against Bruckner. So those are just basic ways in which to look for opportunities rather than obstacles of rediscovering, quote unquote, the something that doesn't need to be discovered. And the other piece is that while orchestras may say they have marketing formulas that lead to that may lead to potentially profitable margins and sustaining themselves, by and large, statistically speaking, orchestras have been having a growing degree of difficulty. And as such, their subscription series are dwindling, their single ticket sales are coming up. So we live in an age of an opportunity. I think we hold on to that opportunity and maximize it in the most positive of ways by introducing something that could be extremely wonderful. And part of the other piece of discovery is that there's a misnomer, not a misnomer, but maybe an unfortunate misconception in that some may think that composers of color only write inaccessible, complex music that's difficult to bring to our stages. Well, the funny thing about neglecting repertoire for hundreds of years is that one might find that there's the music of Mexican Baroque. There are classical composers of both backgrounds who wrote beautiful music that sounds virtually indistinguishable from Mozart and Haydn. And in fact, there is a plethora of romantic repertoire in literature and certainly plenty of neoclassical stuff now. So that already then combats the whole inaccessibility or something sounding pretty or consistent with overtone series, in that there's so much music. I'm not by any means asserting that all music by all composers of any color is good music, but that's the thing. There are only two kinds, the good and the bad kind. And there's plenty of both, which gives us a terrific opportunity to discover things that are good and really tap into it, engage. And I do think that if a handful of orchestras do this in a sensible way, I think others will follow, and it will absolutely shift our canon. And I think there are, one of the other things to say is there are other aficionados of music, orchestral music by Black and Brown composers besides myself. They're fantastic experts. So for an orchestra that may wish to actually step out of its comfort zone and truly make a meaningful difference, imagine if they invite one or two of these experts to co-curate a season or two and create something that is truly, truly reflective. Imagine what can be discovered and what can be shared with the audiences and the kinds of things we all can learn and be better for as a result of that. And that's where that alignment between allocate the budget, where you say your aspirations are going, and some of that budget can go toward that co-curator as well as their expertise and the wealth of information they will bring into that orchestra. And I think all of a sudden you'll find these connections.
Yeah, when the San Francisco Symphony announced Esa-Pekka Salonen as their new music director, and he announced a plan to have 6 collaborators. So it was a brand new model, right? It wasn't a old 60-year-old white person sort of coming up with a season on their own power. He said, I'm an old white guy. I need help. So he found 6 collaborators from all around the spectrum who are unlike him, and to challenge his aesthetics to be stretched. So I think if organizations are willing, there are ways to find new audiences and energize the repertoire, and so that the orchestra is not something that is a curated museum piece from 200 years ago, but it is an ongoing, living and breathing representation of our society. And I think that would find an exciting audience that would be excited and really wanting to have that exchange. I had when Christy Custer, a composer from University of Michigan, responding to the Baltimore Orchestra's statistics, they had done the statistics and really infographics of in 2016, percentage of women composers represented by 50 American orchestras, and there's a terrifyingly low 1.5%. And in 2019, they did a similar study, and it went up a tick to 1.9%. And so Christy sort of sent out a challenge to conductors. Hey, can you guys do better than this? And so I looked at my own programming at Cornell, and I realized to my horror that I had been in that sort of comfortable trope of thinking about repertoire in terms of pieces I already know and the pieces that I've studied as a young musician. And because none of my mentors ever thought about challenging Aaron Dworkin as Stephen Shipps had done when he was studying with him. And, nobody had sort of thrown that gauntlet into my consciousness. So it was just not something I thought about when I thought about repertoire and programming. But as soon as that gauntlet was thrown, okay, wait a minute, let's see if I can find pieces. And I went into this sort of period where I didn't want to just find women composers. I actually wanted to find composers that I wanted to champion that happened to be women. And I found amazing pieces that I basically ran out of a room. It was like 5 seasons worth of stuff. I found Joan Tower's Clarinet Concerto, which after its period was never played again, which is just insane. And so when I present the piece to Rick Faria, who teaches clarinet at college, he said, "This is new. I don't know this piece." And so he spent time with it, and he said, "This should be a repertoire piece." And we had an amazing time, and we performed it on all programs on a young person's concert, right? This 25-minute concerto, and it's the kind of a virtuosic concerto where a person doesn't need to know anything about music. Just the sheer act of Rick Faria negotiating this virtuosic part was a circus act to behold. And the audience that was our young person's concert was very excited about this piece. So I think orchestras have this sort of way to react immediately. Oh, that's going to cost too much. Oh, we're going to lose money. Oh, that piece has never been done. We'll never be able to sell enough tickets to justify that program. But I think, in fact, it can be your catalyst to opening up new avenues to an audience that might never would have considered coming to that concert.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question about it. And I think if we're looking for good music, and if we so happen to add a criterion to it, that it would be by composers who are otherwise highly relevant but have not been heard, we'll find that our options, we're not going to run out of options, that I can guarantee. Even in today's day and age, in fact, it's a fantastic time to experiment with some of this literature, because there are, much like the Philip Herbert elegy that we heard earlier today, there are volumes of works written for that string medium, for reduced orchestra, that can be permissive and consistent with some of these socially distant orchestras and smaller ensembles that we've had to reduce now and experiment with. It's a perfect time to usher in some of that beautiful repertoire. That's really abundant.
And what I love about the work with Sphinx is all of these different arms are really highlighting not only musicians of incredible talent and merit. But like, for example, I got to know Color Simon because of the fact that he won the Sphinx Band. I said, well, okay, let me explore his music. And I realized, holy cow, I can't believe I don't know this guy's music. So it has a way of opening up channels and discussions and avenues into the minds of conductors and musicians, because I think it is so easy for artists, but actually for all people, whether it be engineers, professors, business people, to get comfortable in the known and not willing to venture out into the unknown. Right? I think the whole ICE industry, the internal combustion engine industry, they're going to be dying off because they're so uncomfortable venturing out of their comfort zone of business as usual. So I think this idea that some people present as, well, if we Beethoven 5, Tchaikovsky 5, Mozart 40, that's our bread and butter, that's our way to surviving this pandemic. If that's the way they're thinking, good riddance. Let them die. Let them go out of business, because I think there are enough institutions like the LA Phil who are making, they're celebrating their 100th year anniversary by commissioning 100 composers, and 46 of them women composers. So let's support these arts institutions and orchestras who are venturing out, who are saying, we're going to commit 15, 25% of our budget to make a permanent change and actually make a dent in this problem. So as supporters of this art form, all of our students are students who have been involved with classical music from a very young age, and they will be the first people to come to defense of classical music. So let's encourage our classical music lovers to support organizations and artists who are venturing forth and going to that uncomfortable places, boundaries, in order to make it better, in order to make it a living art. Yeah. Okay, we only got to 3 questions by our students. So what I'm going to do is we only have 8 minutes left before the 6:10 end of the time. I will certainly stay on, and Afa has agreed to stay on until 6:25 to answer any questions. But I know many of you have other classes to get to at 6:10. But I'm going to open it up. Have your videos on, if you want to, after listening to these questions, I've tried my best to sort of pull together all the questions, because many of them kind of touched on similar issues. But I know we didn't get to all of them. But here's your 8-minute chance to really interact with Afa and be in conversation with her. Okay, so the floor is open. So use your hand, raise your hand feature, and we'll try to get to your question. Okay, there are raised hands. Where do they go? Elizabeth Bunker.
Hi, so you were talking about how like the audition process isn't really blind, and I know there's a lot of changes that are happening like because of COVID, and like I feel like a lot of those changes are going to last. So do you have any theories or like ideas about how the audition process might change post-COVID and how that might affect like racial inequality in auditioning?
I would be probably overplaying it if I said I had specific theories, but my suspicions include that at least for a period of time after this kind of twin pandemic period, that some orchestras may take a greater deal of initiative by way of seeking out and inviting, top-ranked musicians of color to their finals, and perhaps engaging and exuding a bit more effort to engage musicians of color and purposely invite them to auditions. Whereas before, the theory and the approach has always been, we're here, we hope that you'll come, and not too much intentionality behind the recruitment. So I think I do see that some of that may occur. I've called for it every time. because we all know that in addition to blind auditions not being blind, orchestras routinely engage in by invitation only auditions as well. And it's not unheard of for some of them to have invited musicians of color, those who are smart. But I think it may potentially be replicated a bit more. Will that be sustained? I don't know, but I sure hope that they do. I hope they do both, because then we stand a chance for some more lasting change.
All right, Emily's next. Emily Muchetti.
Hi, so I was wondering if you had any ideas for how to get started exploring music by underrepresented composers, because I've really not had the opportunity to break out of that kind of like Bach, Beethoven track. And I would love to explore all of that.
Yeah, a simple thing to remember is to go onto Sphinx's homepage and go under resources. There will be links to a variety, depending on your instrument, there's links to a variety of different catalogs and other resources and databases whereby one can locate either resources that point you toward how to obtain a particular piece of music or search around to see what's out there. Depending on your instrument, I or someone on my team also might be able to help if you're looking for a particular thing, because we also have we've put in some resources and created a variety of different catalogs directly at Sphinx too. It mostly encompasses string instruments, but we also have other leads and resources and can always point one. Even if the database doesn't yield something, we can certainly point you to a variety of different folks who are experts in a variety of different areas in this space.
And at the risk of, I got a talk warning from one of my students that I'm not talking too much, but I'm just going to point everybody to the chat where I put in a link to the document that we've been building. It's in support of the Solo Repertoire by Underrepresented Composers Festival we're putting on in March. So I've started to build all kinds of links and resources, including many of the things mentioned by Afa already. So you can look at that as a resource as well. I'm going to actually jump to Taryn's question. So, and this question is, Sphinx will invest 1.5 million over the course of the years to transform the future of cultural diversity, equity, inclusion in the arts. How are the recipients of these grants and funds selected, and what impacts have you seen, do you hope to see? So that is a two-part question.
Definitely. You're referring to our Sphinx Venture Fund, I think. And the manner in which this has been solicited, adjudicated, and selected is that it's an open call, so anyone is qualified to apply. So we've received a fairly, this has only been going on for 2 years, and both years we've received a respectable number of applications from a variety of organizations and leaders in partnership with organizations. So what happens is that there's a preliminary committee that reviews every single application. And they review it for quality, for scope, for impact, and alignment with the Sphinx mission. From there, certain applications move on to the next phase, where we typically have the committee members engage directly with the applicant to kind of answer a series of questions and really vet how well such a project can be carried out. And then from there, typically 2 to 3 winners are selected. The impact we've seen is that both winners of last year's venture fund went into or illustrated, laid out projects in areas that I think are long overdue. One is pedagogy and academic representation. So it's a year-long program that culminates in an in-person gathering organized by the Cleveland Institute of Music, all with the aim of diversifying the ranks of academic leadership. And there, what's interesting is that it's creating mentorships, training opportunities, alliances, and on-ramping, much in the same way that Sphinx does for performers as well as for administrative leaders, but we don't specifically have a program that addresses academic advancement. So in that way, it was a perfect complement to what Sphinx does. So I have seen incredible work go into the planning of this, and really looking forward to next summer, hopefully when we're in person, where that meeting can occur and see what kind of inroads can be built from that. And the other one was New Music USA, and that program was selected because of this incredible ambition and breadth. So it's essentially New Music USA formed 8 different orchestral consortium alliances. So it's 8 groups of various orchestras of all sorts of sizes. Some of them are student orchestras in academic institutions. Most of them are full-time orchestras, and some are in between. And the commitment from each alliance is to commission, fund, perform, premiere, and again perform a work by now 12 different Black and Latinx composers. So all members of all consortia will rotate that, and just the influx and the scope and the wealth of material that's going to hopefully appear on American orchestra stages is just pretty impressive, particularly in a climate where the last measured statistic was right around 1%. So this would obviously make a statistical difference. And for us, changing the canon on every arena, but certainly the orchestral arena is one of the big priorities. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what this will bring about. And I know that the work has already begun. All of the orchestras are on board and all of the composers have already been engaged. So I'm looking forward to see what happens. I heard you mention Jessie Montgomery. She's one of the chosen composers.
So I can't believe we're already at the end of our time. It's 6:10. Some of our students have to go to the next class. But
Sure.
we always take a group photo with everybody, with our guests. So Haruki, Alex, Mark, Jonah, Sangmin, Tiffany, turn your cameras on so we can take a group picture. I'll take 3 of them for us. Please say thank you to Afa for joining us. We'll continue and stay on the call if there are a couple more questions that you'd like to ask. So we'll be here till 6:25. So all right, number 1, 2, 3. Okay, so those of you who have to leave, I'll see you on the 20th. We don't meet on the 14th. And Afa, thank you so much for being here and being an amazing guest addressing these important issues. And we've learned so much about Sphinx, and it's really energizing to be here with you.
My pleasure.
So those of you who are remaining, we have a little bit more time for more questions. So we can take more questions until 6:25. So you have sort of a more intimate setting to ask your questions.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask if you know the artist of the painting behind you. I've been looking at it this whole time. It's really cool.
The artist, it's one of my favorites, actually. It's done by David Garibaldi.
Okay, thank you.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to, unless there's a question, I'm going to fuse Zach and Roosevelt's question. It's about more personal. So was there a moment that you were inspired to take a leading role in social justice reform for the fine arts?
It's a good question. I think the moment came probably earlier than I recognized. It was probably meeting the very first cohort of the Sphinx competition participants and recognizing just the brilliance and the poise and the talent that was within this community, and that it was comparable to any world-class competition in which I either participated or in which I was a spectator. And that feeling and the notion and recognition that this needs to be known by the world. It can't be only known by me and those who surround me. It's ridiculous. So that recognition that this is important, it is for the betterment of the field that I so much love. It's not that it's just the right thing to do for the kids, but it's the right thing for the field. So for me, it was the sense of awakening that I need to make sure to help get it out there. And also a recognition that I potentially could help build something that would have such an impact in building this community and bringing awareness to this issue and establishing this equity of access and just really shedding light on the issue. And I think for me, it was also realizing I can make a bigger difference from within and a lot bigger than I would if I just stood on stage with my violin. I think that recognition was not all rosy, it was poignant, somewhat unusual, and it haunted me for a while, but I learned to look at it as a source of inspiration and a source of belonging.
Yeah, as a student, when I was lucky enough to be there when it started, and my viewpoint of it was, when I knew Aaron was sort of working through it and trying to accomplish it, I was really kind of taken aback by an undergrad could take on this initiative and start it. I mean, that in itself was such a revealing venture that I start to think about what can I do that would make such a similar impact. So it really empowered all of us at the time, and all of us in the School of Music, to witness this project grow from something that was a one person's idea to include many students like you, and then faculty, and then the university and the School of Music, so it was a transformative thing to witness, because I think if I wasn't there to witness it, I don't think I could believe an undergrad could come up with an idea and then execute it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what I think is the biggest lesson for me and for many of my own mentees and students is it's taking a look at a problem and a challenge and saying, I'm uncomfortable sitting about it and observing it and complaining about it. I instead will essentially motivate and do something about it. I think looking at that problem solving aspect of entrepreneurship and really activism in the arts is something that I hope more young people will do. More people will do, period.
Yeah. Because I think so many times I've encountered a position that's contrary to that. Well, musicians don't really do that. We don't get involved politically. We don't get involved with social justice. We do our music thing, and then that's our sort of silo that we stay in, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think in this world, we almost can't afford to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I am talking too much today, so I'm gonna zip it and then let you guys ask questions.
They might have all of their questions answered.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'm gonna I'll pass on any questions that you guys might have and to Afa, and then she will remain a resource for us, as all of our speakers are. But I want to thank Afa once again for taking the time to be with us and sharing your insight and knowledge and your wisdom with us. We're better for it, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, it was great. Absolutely. And for those of you who might find yourselves free next Thursday at 7 p.m., then log on and listen to Sphinx's virtual gala. It's free to experience, and it's going to have a lot of new works, interesting stuff.
I'll be sure to send that link to everybody in the orchestra.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, great to be with you.
Thank you.
Take care.